Eastern State Penitentiary, the 19th century case that still haunts investigators. They had 36 hours before the pattern repeated. The warden didn't believe patterns existed in solitary confinement. Stay with this story. What happened next revealed something the prison had been hiding since 1842. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in cell block 7 of Eastern State Penitentiary on November 3, 2019, holding a ledger that shouldn't have existed. The prison had been abandoned since 1971. A museum now. A tourist attraction. But this ledger, dated 1842 to 1845, documented something the official records never mentioned. 23 deaths. All in the same cell. All within 36 hours of admission. Chen was a forensic historian researching 19th century prison reform. She'd been granted access to recently discovered documents in the penitentiary's archive basement. The ledger was wrapped in canvas, hidden behind a false wall panel in what used to be the warden's private office. Someone had deliberately concealed it. At 2:47 p.m., Chen photographed every page. Cell block 7, cell 12. Between 1842 and 1845, 23 inmates were admitted to that specific cell. All died within 36 hours. Official cause of death: sudden apoplexy or acute melancholia. But the ledger showed something else. Handwritten notes in the margins. Different ink. Different handwriting. Prisoner exhibits extreme agitation upon entry. Refuses all food and water. Claims to hear voices through the walls. Found unresponsive at morning inspection. 23 times. The exact same progression. At 3:15 p.m., Chen walked to cell block 7. Eastern State Penitentiary pioneered solitary confinement in 1829. Each cell was designed for complete isolation. Vaulted ceilings. Thick stone walls. A single skylight called the Eye of God. Cell 12 was in the center of the block. Original construction. Never renovated. Chen entered the cell. 8 feet by 12 feet. Stone walls 18 inches thick. A small wooden door. One skylight 12 feet above. The temperature dropped noticeably inside. She measured it, 54 degrees. The corridor outside was 68. At 3:45 p.m., Chen examined the walls. Stone blocks. Mortar joints. Nothing unusual. Until she noticed the scratches. Hundreds of them. Clustered around the back wall at shoulder height. Desperate. Frantic. She photographed them with a macro lens. The scratches formed patterns. Not random. Deliberate. Words. Barely legible. Carved with fingernails or small stones. She recognized it as Chinese characters meaning, can't hear. No puedo respirar, Spanish for, I can't breathe. Ich kann nicht, German, incomplete. Different languages. Different time periods. All saying the same thing. They couldn't hear. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't. At 4:30 p.m., Chen found the architectural plans in the museum archives. Eastern State was built on a radial design. 7 cell blocks extending from a central hub like spokes on a wheel. But cell block 7, cell 12, was different. The blueprints showed it backed directly onto the prison's original heating system, a network of coal furnaces and ventilation shafts built in 1829. The system was decommissioned in 1845. The same year the deaths in cell 12 stopped. At 5:15 p.m., Chen requested access to the ventilation system beneath cell block 7. The museum director hesitated. That area hasn't been inspected in decades. Structural concerns. I need to see it. At 6 p.m., with a structural engineer and museum staff, Chen descended into the basement beneath cell block 7. The ventilation shafts were intact. Brick-lined tunnels 3 feet in diameter. Covered in coal soot and debris. The shaft directly beneath cell 12 was different. The brickwork was newer. Repaired sometime in the mid-1840s. Why would they repair just this section? The engineer asked. Chen examined the mortar. Because something happened here. Something they needed to hide. They carefully removed 3 bricks. Behind them, a cavity. Deliberately created. Inside the cavity, human remains. Not complete. Fragments. Bone pieces. A skull. And something else. A metal plate. Hand-forged iron. Inscribed with a name, Matthias Cole, 1842. Chen checked the ledger on her phone. Matthias Cole. German immigrant. Admitted to cell block 7, cell 12, on August 14, 1842. Dead 36 hours later. Official cause, acute melancholia. He was the first of the 23. At 7:30 p.m., Chen photographed everything before the authorities were called. The medical examiner arrived at 9 p.m. Preliminary assessment. Remains showed signs of trauma inconsistent with natural death. Blunt force injuries to the skull. Defensive fractures in the hands. At 10:45 p.m., Chen returned to the ledger. She'd missed something earlier. The deaths stopped in 1845. But there was one more entry. October 12, 1845. Cell 12 ventilation shaft sealed by order of Warden Halloway. No further admissions to this cell permitted. 2 weeks after the last death. The warden knew. He'd sealed the ventilation shaft. Stopped assigning inmates to cell 12. Never reported what he'd found. At 11:30 p.m., Chen examined the scratches on the cell walls again. The translations were incomplete. She'd only read the first words. She pulled up the full photographs. Can't hear them below. No puedo respirar el humo. Can't breathe the smoke. Ich kann nicht den Lärm ertragen. I can't bear the noise. They weren't describing isolation. They were describing something happening beneath the cell. Something in the ventilation shaft. But when they checked the prison employment logs from 1842, everything changed. The furnace operator in 1842 wasn't an employee. He was an inmate. At 9:30 a.m. on November 4th, Dr. Chen sat in the Pennsylvania State Archives reviewing personnel records from Eastern State Penitentiary. The heating system was staffed by trustees, inmates granted limited freedom in exchange for labor. From 1829 to 1845, one man held the furnace operator position continuously. Name, Joseph Ridge. Admitted, January 1829. Crime, manslaughter. Sentence, life. Assignment, maintenance and operation of coal heating system. Location, basement ventilation network beneath cell block 7. Chen felt her chest tighten. Ridge had access to the ventilation shafts. Unsupervised. For 16 years. At 10:15 a.m., she found Ridge's intake photograph. The daguerreotype was faded but clear. A man in his 30s. Strong build. Emotionless stare. Beneath the photo, a notation, exhibits violent tendencies when confined. Suitable only for isolation work. At 11 a.m., Chen discovered Ridge's daily work logs. Required documentation. Signed by the warden weekly. August 1842 through October 1845 showed a pattern. Every death in cell 12 corresponded with Ridge's shift in the ventilation system directly below. Matthias Cole died August 16, 1842. Ridge's log. Repairs to ventilation shaft 7 to 12. Extended hours required. Second death, September 3, 1842. Ridge's log. Coal residue removal, shaft 7 to 12. Third death, September 28, 1842. Ridge's log. Structural inspection, shaft 7 to 12. 23 entries. 23 deaths. At 11:45 a.m., the medical examiner called Chen. The remains you found aren't from one person. We've identified bone fragments from at least 4 individuals. 4? But you only found one nameplate. Cole's plate was on top. There are more remains beneath. We're excavating carefully. At 1:30 p.m., Chen found something in the prison's punishment records. Joseph Ridge received disciplinary sanctions 17 times between 1829 and 1842. All for the same infraction, unauthorized communication with inmates in solitary confinement. The punishments were minimal. 3 days reduced rations. 1 week confined to quarters. Then, after 1842, the infraction stopped. No violations. No reports. Perfect conduct for 3 years. Until October 1845. Final entry, inmate Joseph Ridge deceased. October 28, 1845. Cause, Accidental death during ventilation maintenance. At 2:15 p.m., Chen requested Ridge's death investigation file. The museum director looked uncomfortable. Those records were destroyed in a fire in 1923. We only have the summary report. Let me see it. The summary was 2 paragraphs. Inmate Ridge was discovered deceased in the ventilation shaft beneath cell block 7 during routine inspection. Injuries consistent with collapse of masonry. Body recovered and buried in Potter's Field. Investigation concluded accidental death. Ventilation system decommissioned following incident. At 3 p.m., structural engineers completed their excavation of the cavity beneath cell 12. Total remains, fragments from 11 individuals. 11. Not 23. Chen checked the dates. The first death was August 1842. The last was October 1845. 38 months. 23 deaths. But only 11 bodies hidden in the shaft. Where were the other 12? At 4:30 p.m., Chen examined the cell assignments from the ledger more carefully. She'd assumed all 23 inmates died in cell 12. But the wording was specific. Admitted to cell block 7, cell 12. Admitted, not died. She cross-referenced with burial records. 12 of the 23 inmates were listed as buried in the prison cemetery with proper documentation. The other 11 had no burial records. Listed only as deceased, disposal per protocol. At 5:45 p.m., a forensic anthropologist arrived at the excavation site. The remains show pattern trauma. Blunt force to the skull. All from above. Someone killed them from inside the cell? No. The angle suggests the injuries came from below. Through the ventilation grate. Chen understood. Ridge would wait in the shaft beneath cell 12. When an inmate was alone, solitary confinement guaranteed that he would remove the grate from below and attack through the opening. The victims would have been terrified, isolated, unable to call for help in a system designed for silence. At 7 p.m., Chen found Warden Halloway's private correspondence. Letters to the prison board. Dated September 1845. I have discovered irregularities in the ventilation maintenance. Inmate Ridge's access must be terminated immediately. I fear we have overlooked something of grave consequence. Response from the board, dated September 29, 1845. Your concerns are noted. However, Ridge's work has been satisfactory for 16 years. We see no cause for alarm. Halloway's reply, October 1, 1845. I am conducting a personal investigation. I believe inmates in cell 12 have been subjected to torment we did not authorize. Ridge must be removed. No response from the board. At 8:30 p.m., Chen found the final piece. A medical report dated October 27, 1845. One day before Ridge's death. Warden Halloway had ordered a physical examination of Joseph Ridge. The doctor's notes. Inmate exhibits scratches on hands and forearms. Fresh injuries. When questioned, claims maintenance work. Upon inspection of ventilation shaft, discovered fresh blood on grate beneath cell 12. Recommend immediate investigation. The next day, Ridge was dead. Accidental death during ventilation maintenance. At 9:15 p.m., the police investigator reviewing the case called Chen. We've been through the timeline. Halloway discovered what Ridge was doing on October 27th. Ridge died October 28th. The ventilation system was sealed within 2 weeks. You think Halloway killed him? I think Halloway found Ridge in the shaft beneath cell 12 and there was a confrontation. Whether it was self-defense or murder, we'll never know. But Halloway covered it up. Sealed the shaft with Ridge's victims still inside. Classified it as an accident. Protected the prison's reputation. At 10:30 p.m., Chen stood in cell 12 one final time. She thought about the inmates who died here. Isolated. Terrified. Attacked from below by a man who had 16 years to perfect his system. She thought about the 12 who survived Ridge's attacks but died anyway, from terror, from injuries, from the psychological trauma of solitary confinement combined with unexplainable violence. She thought about Warden Halloway, who discovered the truth and chose to bury it rather than admit the prison's reform system had enabled a predator for 16 years. And when they analyzed Ridge's intake crime from 1829, the manslaughter that got him life in prison, they discovered the victim had been a prison guard at a different facility who had tried to stop Ridge from accessing areas where inmates were held in isolation. Ridge had done this before. At 8 a.m. on November 5th, Dr. Chen received the historical crime records from Philadelphia County. Joseph Ridge's 1829 conviction wasn't random violence. It was premeditated murder. The victim, Thomas Brennan, night guard at Walnut Street Jail, Philadelphia's first prison. Date: December 1828. Brennan had discovered Ridge, then working as a maintenance contractor, in the solitary confinement wing after hours. When Brennan tried to remove him, Ridge attacked with a coal shovel. Brennan died from head trauma. Ridge was arrested on site. During the trial, 3 inmates from Walnut Street testified. All claimed they'd heard screaming from the solitary cells at night. All claimed Brennan had been investigating. The prosecution argued Ridge was stealing from cells. But the inmates said something else. Ridge had been talking to prisoners through the walls. The jury convicted him of manslaughter, not murder. Sentence: life imprisonment. Eastern State Penitentiary, brand new, built on revolutionary principles of isolation and reform, accepted the transfer in January 1829. They assigned him to heating maintenance. Alone. Unsupervised. With access to every solitary cell in the prison. At 9:30 a.m., a psychologist specializing in historical criminal behavior reviewed Ridge's case file. This wasn't opportunistic, Dr. Marcus Webb explained. Ridge specifically sought access to isolated prisoners. The violence at Walnut Street wasn't about theft, it was about preserving his access. Why target inmates in solitary? Complete control. No witnesses. Victims who can't call for help. In the 19th century, a prisoner in solitary confinement reporting an attack from beneath their cell? They'd be dismissed as insane. The system itself protected him. At 10:45 a.m., Chen discovered why Ridge's crimes stopped in 1842 and resumed months later. Prison records showed cell block 7 was under renovation from March to July 1842. The ventilation system was temporarily shut down. Ridge was reassigned to laundry duty. Matthias Cole, the first victim, was admitted to cell 12 on August 14, 1842. 2 weeks after Ridge returned to furnace operations. Ridge had waited, patient, until he had access again. At 12 p.m., forensic analysis confirmed the anthropologist's findings. All 11 victims discovered in the shaft died from blunt force trauma delivered through the ventilation grate. But the bone fragments showed something else. Evidence of prolonged torture. Injuries inflicted over hours, not minutes. He wasn't just killing them, the forensic pathologist explained. He was tormenting them first. The scratches on the cell walls, those inmates were alive long enough to try to communicate what was happening. At 1:30 p.m., Chen found the explanation for the 12 survivors. Cross-referencing the 23 names with prison records showed a pattern. The 12 who were properly buried had family members. Outside advocates. People who demanded answers when they died. The 11 hidden in the shaft had no one. Immigrants. Indigents. Men the system had already forgotten. Ridge chose his victims carefully. At 2:45 p.m., archival researchers found Warden Halloway's personal journal. Hidden in his descendants' estate. Never made public. October 27, 1845 entry. I descended into the shaft today following Dr. Morrison's report of blood. What I discovered there defies description. Ridge had created a chamber. A space where he could access the grate beneath cell 12 unseen. I found tools. A stool. Evidence he had been using this space for years. When I confronted him, he showed no remorse. Said the prisoners deserved it. Said isolation made them weak. Said he was testing them. I could not let him continue. God forgive me for what I did next. The next entry, October 29th. Ridge is dead. I have sealed the shaft. I have told the board it was an accident. I cannot admit we gave a murderer 16 years of unrestricted access to our most vulnerable prisoners. I cannot admit our reform system, our great experiment in solitary reflection, became his hunting ground. This truth must die with him. At 4 p.m., Chen stood before the museum board presenting her findings. Between 1829 and 1845, Eastern State Penitentiary's solitary confinement system enabled a serial killer to torture and murder at least 11 inmates. The prison administration discovered this in 1845 and covered it up to protect the institution's reputation. The board chairman shifted uncomfortably. This was nearly 200 years ago. What purpose does exposing it serve now? Because we're still using solitary confinement. Because we still isolate vulnerable people and call it reform. Because the same systemic failures that allowed Ridge to operate for 16 years still exist. At 5:30 p.m., the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections issued a statement. They would conduct a full historical review. They would memorialize the 11 victims. They would examine current solitary confinement practices. At 7 p.m., Chen received a call from a corrections officer in Colorado. I saw the news about your research. You should know, we found similar scratch marks in our segregation unit. Different language, same message. Can't breathe. Can't hear. Can't. Chen felt ice in her veins. How old is your facility? Built in 1993. But it's on the site of an older prison. They kept some of the original basement infrastructure. At 8:30 p.m., Chen began mapping other 19th century prisons with similar designs. 17 facilities across the United States were built using Eastern State's radial plan between 1829 and 1860. 12 were still operational. 5 were museums. All used solitary confinement. All had basement ventilation systems. All had trusted inmates performing maintenance. At 10 p.m., she accessed digitized records from Sing Sing, New York. 1847 to 1852, 6 unexplained deaths in their isolation wing. All listed as sudden illness. All in cells above the heating system. At 11:30 p.m., Chen found records from Ohio State Penitentiary. 1851 to 1856, 9 deaths in solitary. Acute melancholia. All in cell block D, directly above the coal furnaces. The pattern repeated. Prison after prison. Decade after decade. Inmates given access to vulnerable populations. Deaths dismissed as mental illness or natural causes. Systems designed for isolation becoming systems that enabled predators. At midnight, Chen wrote her final report. Joseph Ridge was not an anomaly. He was a symptom. The 19th century prison reform movement created perfect conditions for this abuse: isolated victims, unsupervised access, institutional denial, and a belief system that blamed prisoners for their own suffering. We stopped using coal furnaces. We modernized our prisons. But we never stopped isolating people. We never stopped trusting systems over individuals. We never stopped dismissing the voices of those we've locked away. The report concluded with a question that haunted her. How many others were there? How many maintenance workers, trustees, contractors, and staff had unsupervised access to isolated prisoners? How many times did institutions choose reputation over truth? How many voices scratched into walls did we ignore because we'd already decided those voices didn't matter? On November 6, 2019, the 11 victims found beneath cell 12 were given proper burial. Their names, Matthias Cole and 10 others identified through forensic genealogy, were engraved on a memorial at Eastern State Penitentiary. The museum added an exhibit about their deaths. About Ridge. About Halloway's cover-up. About the systemic failures that made it possible. But Chen knew the truth was darker. Ridge had 16 years at Eastern State. Unknown years at Walnut Street before that. Even if he killed one person per year, the body count exceeded what they'd found. Most of his victims were likely recorded as natural deaths, buried properly, their murders never suspected. The 11 in the shaft were just the ones who disappeared completely. The ones no one came looking for. At the memorial service, a descendant of Matthias Cole spoke. My ancestor died alone, in the dark, in a system that promised reform but delivered torment. For 174 years, no one knew. No one investigated. No one cared. How many others are still hidden? How many families never got answers? Chen stood in the back, thinking about the scratch marks in Colorado, the unexplained deaths in Sing Sing and Ohio, the 17 prisons built on the same model. She thought about modern solitary confinement units, about prisoners reporting abuse that gets dismissed as manipulation, about systems that still prioritize institutional reputation over individual truth. This could happen again. Because we still isolate people and call it safety. Because we still trust systems that haven't earned that trust. Because we still don't listen when the vulnerable try to tell us something is wrong. Ridge has been dead for 179 years. But the conditions that enabled him, isolation, institutional denial, and society's willingness to forget the forgotten, those haven't changed at all. If this story shook you, the next one will be worse.